Thomas Elderglen's calloused hands grip the shovel as he stands before the seventh tiny grave in 2 years. The metal handle feels foreign against his palms, as if the tool itself rebels against this unnatural task. September fog rolls across their San Jose homestead like spectral fingers reaching for something precious, something already lost. Behind him, his wife Margaret has collapsed against the ancient oak tree, her black mourning dress torn at the knees from where she fell moments earlier, overcome by a grief so profound it has carved hollow spaces beneath her eyes. The sound that emerges from the farmhouse windows cuts through the evening air, his surviving children, Emma at 9 years old and little Samuel barely 3, whimpering like wounded animals. They have learned to fear the shovel's song, the rhythmic scraping that signals another sibling will never return to the dinner table. Thomas drives the blade into the earth with mechanical precision, each thrust of metal into soil a testament to a father's breaking heart. Then the shovel strikes something that shouldn't exist in this consecrated ground. The metallic ring echoes across the homestead, a sound that doesn't belong to stone or root or the natural resistance of earth. Thomas freezes, his weathered hands trembling around the handle as he realizes this discovery will change everything. Margaret lifts her head from where it has rested against the oak's rough bark. Her auburn hair, once her pride, now hangs in desperate tangles around a face aged decades in mere months. When she speaks, her voice carries the terrible weight of a mother who has counted too many small coffins. Thomas, what if God isn't taking them? The words hang in the fog-thick air like a blasphemy waiting to be born. Thomas looks at his wife, at the wild intelligence burning in her grief-carved features, and feels something cold settle in his chest. This is not the rambling of hysteria. This is the careful observation of a woman who has held 7 dying children and found no earthly explanation for their suffering. What if something else is? Margaret continues, rising unsteadily to her feet. Her torn dress catches on the oak's bark, but she doesn't notice. Her attention has fixed on the strange protrusion emerging from the grave dirt, metallic and deliberately buried. Thomas sets down the shovel and kneels beside the small excavation. His fingers brush away centuries of accumulated soil, revealing the corner of what appears to be a brass box. The metal surface gleams with an oily sheen that seems to repel the evening light rather than reflect it. Strange markings cover its visible surface, symbols that twist and curve in patterns that make his eyes water when he stares too long. Margaret, come look at this. His voice sounds hollow, as if the fog has stolen its strength. This was buried deep. Deliberately hidden. She approaches with the careful steps of someone who has learned that hope can be more dangerous than despair. When she kneels beside him in the soft earth, Thomas can smell the familiar scent of her skin beneath the overwhelming odor of death that has clung to their family for months. Her fingers trace the brass box's edges with the reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. I've seen these symbols before, Margaret whispers. In my grandmother's things, the ones she brought from Ireland. She always said they were protection against the hungry dark. Thomas works his fingers around the box's edges, feeling its weight as he lifts it from its earthen hiding place. The object feels heavier than its size suggests, as if it contains more than mere physical substance. The brass surface bears intricate engravings that seem to shift and move in his peripheral vision, Celtic knots intertwined with something older, more primitive, symbols that predate the cross his family has worn for generations. From the farmhouse comes the sound of Samuel's coughing, a wet, rattling sound that both parents recognize with the terror of familiarity. Emma's voice follows, calling for her mother with the desperate note that has preceded too many midnight vigils beside small deathbeds. We should go to them, Thomas says, but his hands remain fixed on the brass box, as if it has claimed ownership of his attention. Margaret shakes her head. Not yet. First, we need to understand what we've found. What if this is why they're dying, Thomas? What if this thing has been poisoning our land, our children, all this time? The fog thickens around them as evening deepens into night. In the distance, coyotes begin their nightly chorus, but tonight their howls sound different, less like wild animals and more like voices raised in lamentation. Thomas feels the weight of 7 small graves at his back and the terrible possibility that more might follow. "Open it," Margaret says, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Whatever's inside, it can't be worse than not knowing." Thomas finds a small clasp on the box's front, tarnished with age but still functional. As his thumb works the mechanism, he feels a brief resistance, as if something inside pushes back against his intrusion. Then the clasp gives way with a sound like a sigh, and the lid opens to reveal contents that will haunt his dreams for the remainder of his days. Inside, nestled against faded velvet lining, lies a scroll of aged parchment tied with what appears to be human hair. Beside it rests a small glass vial containing a substance too dark to be ink, too red to be anything but blood. The parchment bears writing in a script neither Thomas nor Margaret can read, but somehow they both understand its malevolent purpose. "This is why they're dying," Margaret says with absolute certainty. "This is what's been taking our babies. Have you ever lost something so precious that you'd dig up the earth itself to get it back?" The brass box sits open on their kitchen table like a wound in the heart of their home. Margaret has lit every candle and oil lamp they possess, yet shadows still gather in the corners, drawn by something older than flame. Thomas paces the length of the room, his boots echoing against floorboards that have witnessed too many small footsteps, now silent forever. Emma stands in the doorway between kitchen and parlor, her small frame backlit by the dying embers in the fireplace. At 9, she has already learned to read the signs of adult despair, and tonight those signs cover her parents' faces like funeral shrouds. "Mama, what's in the box?" Emma's voice carries the careful tone children use when they sense dangerous adult secrets. Margaret looks up from where she has been studying the strange parchment, her fingers still tracing symbols that seem to burn themselves into her memory. "Something that doesn't belong to us, sweet girl. Something that should have stayed buried." The parchment bears text written in what Thomas now recognizes as Gaelic, the language his grandfather Seamus spoke in whispers during his final years. Below the incomprehensible words, someone has drawn a diagram that needs no translation, a family tree with branches that end not in new growth but in small crosses. 7 crosses for each generation, marking deaths that come too early, too mysteriously. "Can you read any of it?" Thomas asks, though he dreads the answer. Margaret nods slowly. "Some. My grandmother taught me a few words when I was Emma's age. She said it was important to remember where we came from, even if we could never go back." She points to a line near the top of the parchment. "This word here, Seol, it means seed or offspring. And this one, Iabert, sacrifice." Her voice grows smaller with each translation. "But there's something else. A name. Seamus Elderglen." The name hits Thomas like a physical blow. His grandfather, the man who had fled Ireland with nothing but desperate hope and a darkness he would never speak about. The man who had established their homestead on this exact plot of land, claiming the soil was blessed for growing things. He made a bargain, Margaret continues, her finger following lines of text as if reading a death sentence. In 1803, during the worst of the hunger in Donegal, he found something in the old places, something that had been sleeping in the peat bogs since before Christ walked the earth. Emma steps fully into the kitchen, drawn by the terrible magnetism of adult secrets being revealed. "What kind of something, Mama?" Margaret's hands tremble as she translates more of the archaic text. "Something that feeds on innocence. Something that promised prosperity in the new world in exchange for the sweetest sacrifice, children's lives. 7 from each generation, taken before they could carry the curse forward to their own offspring." The glass vial catches candlelight and throws red shadows against the kitchen walls. Thomas reaches for it with unwilling fascination, noting how the liquid inside seems to move with its own purpose, swirling in patterns that suggest intelligence. "This is blood," he says, though the certainty brings no comfort. But whose? The first 7, Margaret whispers. Seamus's own children. He sealed the pact with their lives, and every generation since has paid the price. From upstairs comes the sound of Samuel's labored breathing, punctuated by coughs that sound increasingly desperate. Emma's eyes widen as she performs calculations no child should understand. "Mama, we had 7 brothers and sisters who died. That means Samuel and I are safe now, right? The hungry thing got what it wanted." The hope in her daughter's voice breaks Margaret's heart more completely than grief ever could. She looks at Thomas, seeing her own terrible realization reflected in his eyes. They have been counting wrong. The curse doesn't take 7 children and then move to the next generation. It takes 7 children and then begins again, an endless harvest that continues until the bloodline ends. "Emma, sweetheart, go check on your brother," Margaret says, forcing steadiness into her voice. "Make sure he has water and that his fever hasn't gotten worse." As their daughter climbs the stairs, her small feet creating the only innocent sound in a house full of malevolent secrets, Thomas finally speaks the truth they have both been avoiding. "We're not the first generation to lose 7 children. We're just the latest. This thing has been feeding on our family for 60 years. Margaret's finger finds another section of the parchment, where someone has drawn a calendar marking phases of the moon. Each mark corresponds to a small cross, and the pattern becomes horrifyingly clear. Every death has occurred during the new moon, exactly 67 days apart, as regular as clockwork. "It's not random," she says, her voice gaining strength from understanding, even terrible understanding. "It's a schedule. A harvest timetable." Thomas calculates quickly, counting days since their last child's death. "That gives us 19 days before the next new moon. 19 days to find a way to break this curse before it takes Samuel." The candlelight flickers as if responding to an unfelt wind, and both parents feel the weight of something ancient and hungry stirring in response to their newfound knowledge. The brass box seems to pulse with malevolent life, and Margaret realizes with growing horror that by opening it, by reading its contents, they may have announced their intention to fight back. From upstairs comes Emma's voice, high and strained with fear. "Mama! Papa! Come quickly. Samuel's talking to someone, but there's nobody in his room." The parchment crumbles slightly under Margaret's grip as ancient ink meets desperate tears. In the dying candlelight, the symbols seem to writhe like living things, and somewhere in the darkness beyond their homestead, something that has waited 60 years for its next harvest begins to take notice of the family that dares to resist its hunger. Margaret's handwriting grows increasingly frantic as she fills page after page of her household ledger with details no mother should ever need to record. Each child's name appears at the top of its own section, followed by dates, symptoms, and final moments documented with the precision of a coroner and the desperation of a woman searching for patterns in chaos. Mary, aged 4, fever began October 12, speaking to empty corners October 14, peaceful passing October 16. Her pen scratches against paper worn thin by tears. Little James, aged 2, fever began December 18, seeing things we couldn't see December 20, gone December 22. Thomas sits across from her at the kitchen table, the brass box pushed to one side but never out of sight. Dawn light filters through windows fogged with condensation and grief, revealing a man aged beyond his 43 years. His calloused fingers work through calculations on a separate piece of paper, counting days between deaths with mathematical precision. 67 days, he confirms, his voice hoarse from a sleepless night. Exactly 67 days between each death, always starting on the new moon. Emma appears at the foot of the stairs, her face pale with exhaustion. She has spent the night in Samuel's room, watching over her baby brother with the fierce protectiveness of a child who has lost too many siblings. Her dress is wrinkled from sleeping in a chair, and her dark hair hangs in tangles around shoulders too thin for bearing such responsibility. "Mama, Samuel's fever broke just before sunrise," she reports. But he's still talking to her. Margaret's pen stops moving. "Still talking to who, sweetheart?" "The lady in the corner. She's been there all night, singing lullabies in a language I don't understand. Samuel seems to like her, but she makes me feel cold inside." Thomas and Margaret exchange glances loaded with supernatural dread. The curse is already beginning its work, marking their youngest child for harvest. But Emma's words carry an even more disturbing implication: she can see the entity too. "Emma, describe this lady to me," Margaret says, setting down her pen with forced calm. Their daughter's description chills them both to the bone. She speaks of a woman with skin pale as winter morning frost, wearing a dress that rustles like autumn leaves despite the absence of any wind. The entity's eyes reflect candlelight even in darkness, and when she smiles, Emma can see too many teeth, all of them sharp as needles. "She tells stories about our family," Emma continues, settling into the chair beside her mother. "About children who went before us, about how death is just another kind of sleep and everyone will be together soon. She knows all their names, Mama. Even the babies who died before I was born." Margaret's maternal instincts war with growing supernatural terror as she realizes Emma is describing someone who could not possibly exist in the natural world. The woman's appearance matches perfectly with the daguerreotype hanging in their bedroom, Thomas's great-grandmother, Margaret Elderglen, who died 30 years before Emma was born. "She says she's been waiting for us," Emma adds, her child's voice carrying words no 9-year-old should understand. "She says the hunger is almost satisfied, and then our family can rest." Thomas pushes back from the table with such force that his chair scrapes against the floorboards like fingernails on a coffin lid. "Show me Samuel's room. Now." They climb the stairs together, a procession of the damned ascending toward a confrontation with forces beyond their comprehension. Samuel's room occupies the corner of their small second floor, its single window facing east toward the family cemetery where 7 small graves mark the curse's progression. The 3-year-old sits upright in his bed, fever-bright eyes focused on the corner where Emma claims to see their supernatural tormentor. His lips move in conversation with empty air, but occasionally his small voice becomes audible. "Yes, ma'am, I understand," Samuel says to the vacant corner. "Papa and Mama don't know about the harvest yet, but you're teaching me. You say it doesn't hurt." Margaret's legs give way, and Thomas catches her before she can fall. Their baby is negotiating the terms of his own death with something that has been claiming Elderglen children for 3 generations. "Samuel, look at Mama," Margaret calls, forcing strength into her voice. "Who are you talking to, sweet boy?" Their son turns toward them with the eerily calm expression of a child who has been promised wonderful things by something terrible. "The grandmother lady, Mama. She's been telling me about the others, about Mary and James and all the rest. She says they're not really gone, just sleeping until the family can be together." Thomas moves to the corner where both children claim to see the entity. The space feels colder than the rest of the room, and when he extends his hand, something like static electricity raises the hair on his arms. But he sees nothing, feels nothing beyond an overwhelming sense of presence and malevolent patience. "She's right there, Papa," Emma whispers. "She's smiling at you, but it's not a nice smile. It's the smile of something that's very, very hungry." Margaret forces herself to approach Samuel's bedside. "Baby, you need to stop talking to the lady. She's not really your grandmother. She's something else, something that wants to hurt you." Samuel's fever-bright eyes focus on his mother with disturbing clarity. "She says you don't understand, Mama. She says it's not a curse at all. She says it's a harvest, and we're the crop that was planted long ago." The words come from Samuel's mouth, but the phrasing belongs to someone infinitely older and more malicious. Thomas realizes with growing horror that their youngest child is becoming a vessel for communication with whatever entity has been claiming their family members. "She wants me to tell you something important," Samuel continues, his small voice carrying supernatural authority. "She says great-great-grandfather Seamus made the bargain to save his starving family, but he didn't understand the terms. The harvest never ends, Papa. It just begins again with each new generation." Margaret sinks into the chair beside Samuel's bed, the same chair where she has held vigil over too many dying children. "How many more?" she asks, directing the question toward the empty corner her children claim holds their tormentor. "How many more of our babies will you take?" Samuel tilts his head as if listening to whispered instructions, then delivers the answer that breaks both parents' hearts. "She says all of them, Mama. Every Elderglen child until there are no more Elderglen children to take. That's what great-great-grandfather promised, the entire bloodline as payment for prosperity in the new world." The mathematics of their situation becomes terrifyingly clear. The entity doesn't want 7 children from each generation, it wants 7 children, then 7 more, then 7 more, until the family name dies out completely. They are not victims of supernatural misfortune. They are livestock, carefully maintained for an endless harvest of innocence. Emma moves to stand beside her parents, her small hand finding Margaret's trembling fingers. "Mama, the lady says there's something else. She says if we're very good and don't fight, Samuel won't have to suffer like the others did. She can make it peaceful, like going to sleep." The offer hangs in the air like a blasphemous prayer, and Margaret realizes they have reached the point where hope becomes more dangerous than despair. Whatever is claiming their children wants them to cooperate, to accept the inevitable, to become willing participants in their own family's destruction. But as she looks at Samuel's fevered face and Emma's haunted eyes, Margaret Elderglen makes a decision that will define the remainder of her days. She will not go gentle into this supernatural night. She will fight for her children with every breath in her body, even if it means confronting forces that have been feeding on her bloodline since before she was born. The entity in the corner seems to sense her newfound resolve, because Samuel suddenly gasps and his eyes roll back in his head. When he speaks again, his voice carries an ancient Irish accent that belongs to someone long dead. "You cannot fight what was willingly given, child. The bargain was made in blood and desperation, and it will be honored until the very last Elderglen draws breath." The woman in Samuel's room grows bolder as the new moon approaches. Emma describes her increasing clarity, no longer a translucent figure hovering in corners, but a solid presence that sits on the edge of Samuel's bed, stroking his fever-damp hair with fingers that leave no physical trace but imprint themselves on the child's soul. She's wearing a dress like the one in the old photograph, Emma tells her parents over breakfast, her small hands wrapped around a cup of milk she cannot bring herself to drink. The green one with tiny buttons. And she smells like the cemetery after rain. Margaret sets down her own cup with trembling fingers. The photograph Emma references hangs in their bedroom, a daguerreotype of Bridget Elderglen taken shortly before her death in 1834. The dress is indeed green silk with pearl buttons, a garment that would have been buried with its owner 30 years ago. What does she say to Samuel? Thomas asks, though he dreads the answer. She tells him stories about the old country, about the hunger that drove great-great-grandfather to make his bargain. She says the thing he found in the peat bogs was older than Christ, older than the Druids, older than memory itself. It was sleeping until the famine woke it with the scent of desperation. Emma's vocabulary has expanded beyond her years, filled with concepts no 9-year-old should understand. The entity is educating her, preparing her for something that fills Margaret with maternal terror. She says the bargain wasn't just about prosperity, Emma continues. It was about survival. The thing promised that Elderglen blood would thrive in America, that we would own land and never know hunger. But the price was set before great-great-grandfather understood what he was agreeing to. Thomas ventures upstairs to check on Samuel, finding their youngest son sitting upright in bed despite his fever. The 3-year-old's eyes track movement in empty air, and his lips curve in smiles responding to unheard jokes. But most disturbing of all, Samuel appears to be aging, not physically, but mentally. His vocabulary has expanded overnight, and he speaks with the cadence of someone far older. "Papa, she's teaching me about the harvest," Samuel says without looking away from his invisible companion. "She says each child who goes before makes the crossing easier for the next. Mary and James and all the others, they're not really gone. They're just waiting on the other side to help me when my time comes." "Your time isn't coming," Thomas says with fierce determination. "Mama and I won't let that happen." Samuel finally turns toward his father, and Thomas sees something terrifying in the child's fevered gaze: acceptance. The supernatural entity has been conditioning Samuel to embrace his fate, making death seem like a reunion rather than an ending. "Papa, she says you can't fight what great-great-grandfather willingly gave. The contract was written in blood and sealed with the lives of his own children. Every generation since has honored the terms, even when they didn't understand them." The words come from Samuel's mouth, but the phrasing belongs to someone infinitely older. Thomas realizes their youngest child is becoming a conduit for communication with the entity, his small body serving as a bridge between worlds. Margaret appears in the doorway, carrying a tray of broth and medicine that she knows will do nothing against supernatural malevolence. "Samuel, sweet boy, you need to stop listening to the lady. She's not trying to help you. She's trying to take you away from us. She says you don't understand, Mama," Samuel replies with eerie calm. "She says dying isn't the worst thing that can happen to a family. The worst thing is having the harvest interrupted, because then the hungry thing gets angry and takes more than it was promised. The threat hangs in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. The entity is offering them a choice: accept Samuel's death as part of the natural order, or risk losing Emma as well through supernatural retribution." That evening, Thomas descends into their cellar to retrieve preserved vegetables for dinner, but what he discovers beneath their house changes everything. The stone foundation bears markings he has never noticed before, 7 small handprints pressed into the rock as if the stone were soft clay when the prints were made. Each handprint is slightly larger than the last, suggesting children of increasing age. But most disturbing of all, the prints appear fresh, as if they were made recently despite the foundation being laid decades ago. Thomas runs his fingers over the impressions, feeling warmth that has nothing to do with living flesh. "Margaret," he calls, his voice echoing in the confined space. "You need to see this." She descends the cellar stairs with Emma close behind, both drawn by the urgency in Thomas's voice. When they see the handprints, Margaret's knees buckle and Emma releases a small cry of recognition. "Those are their hands," Emma whispers. "Mary's and James's and all the others. The lady showed them to me in dreams. She says the foundation of our house was built on their promise to return." Margaret traces the largest handprint with shaking fingers. "Thomas, this foundation was laid before we were married, before any of our children were born. How can their handprints be here?" The answer comes from Samuel, whose small voice drifts down from the top of the cellar stairs. He has left his sick bed and stands silhouetted against the kitchen light, looking like a ghost of himself. "She says time works differently for the harvest," Samuel explains with supernatural authority. "The children who go before help prepare the way for those who come after. Their handprints have been waiting here since the house was built, because the hungry thing always knew exactly which children it would claim." Emma moves to stand beside her baby brother, and Thomas sees something that stops his heart. She is beginning to fade around the edges, becoming translucent like the entity she describes visiting Samuel's room. The supernatural influence is claiming both of his surviving children, drawing them into whatever realm exists between life and death. "Papa, the lady wants to show you something," Emma says, her voice gaining an ethereal quality. She wants you to understand that fighting the harvest will only make things worse for everyone. The cellar fills with the scent of earth and decay, and Thomas feels the weight of 7 small graves pressing down on his shoulders. But as he looks at his fading children, at his wife's grief-carved face, at the handprints of the dead pressed into the foundation of their home, Thomas Elderglen makes a decision that will define the remainder of his days. He will not surrender another child to supernatural hunger. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, he will find a way to break the chain that has bound his family for 3 generations. The harvest ends here, with him, or it will continue until the last Elderglen child draws breath. But as he climbs the cellar stairs with his family, Thomas does not notice the 8th handprint that appears in the stone behind them, small and fresh and waiting for Emma's hand to fill its impression. Thomas rides through the pre-dawn darkness toward San Jose's newly constructed Catholic church, his horse's hooves echoing against empty streets like funeral drums. Fog clings to the valley floor, transforming familiar landmarks into ghostly suggestions of themselves. He carries the brass box in his saddlebags, its weight seeming to increase with every mile, as if the cursed object grows heavier as it moves closer to consecrated ground. Father Mackenzie is tending to morning prayers when Thomas arrives, but the Irish priest's face pales at the mention of the Elderglen name. The young cleric, barely 30 and new to California from County Cork, crosses himself repeatedly as Thomas explains their supernatural predicament. Some names carry darkness across oceans, Father Mackenzie says, his brogue thick with fear. Elderglen is one of them. My own grandfather spoke of Seamus Elderglen's bargain, the pact made in the peat bogs during the worst of the hunger. Thomas produces the brass box, setting it on the altar with hands that shake despite his determination. Then you know what this is. You know what it's been doing to my family. Father Mackenzie recoils from the cursed object as if it were a venomous snake. I know enough to understand that some sins cannot be absolved by prayer alone. They must be confronted where they were born, by those who have the courage to face what their ancestors unleashed. Will you help us? Thomas asks, desperation bleeding through his carefully maintained composure. The priest's refusal comes swift and final. I cannot set foot on your land, Thomas Elderglen. The church has records of what your great-grandfather did, the bargain he made with something that should have remained sleeping. My presence would only anger the entity further, and I have my own congregation to protect. Thomas rides home empty-handed, but his journey has not been entirely wasted. Father Mackenzie's words have confirmed what he already suspected, the curse originated in Ireland, in the desperate act of a starving man who made a bargain with forces beyond his understanding. Meanwhile, Margaret has begun experiencing visions that blur the line between memory and madness. She sees Seamus Elderglen as if she were standing beside him in the peat bogs of Donegal, watching her husband's grandfather kneel before something ancient and hungry that emerged from the earth itself. The entity appears to her as it appeared to Seamus, not as the pale woman who visits their children, but as something far more primitive and terrible. It rises from the bog like accumulated nightmare, composed of peat and bone and the desperate prayers of the starving. When it speaks, its voice carries the weight of geological time, older than human civilization, older than memory itself. You offer me what, mortal child? The entity asks Seamus in Margaret's vision. What do you possess that could interest something that has fed on human suffering since your kind first walked upright? Seamus, gaunt with hunger and hollow-eyed with desperation, offers the only thing he has left, his bloodline's future. Take my children, he pleads, but let my line prosper in the new world. Let us never know hunger again. The entity's laughter sounds like wind through graveyards. Your children, yes, but not just your children. All the children your blood will ever produce, generation after generation, until your name dies out completely. 7 from each family, taken in their innocence, their life force feeding my eternal hunger. Margaret watches in horror as Seamus agrees to terms he doesn't fully understand, sealing the bargain with his own blood drawn across symbols carved into bog-soaked wood. The contract is written in a language that predates Latin, predates Gaelic, predates human speech itself. As Samuel's condition worsens, the supernatural manifestations intensify throughout their homestead. Footsteps echo through empty rooms, following no human pattern of movement. Lullabies drift through the walls, sung in languages that died with druids. Most disturbing of all, they begin hearing children's laughter emanating from within the walls themselves, as if their lost offspring have taken up residence in the very structure of their home. Emma serves as an increasingly reliable conduit between the worlds of the living and the dead. She reports conversations with her deceased siblings, who appear to her with increasing frequency and clarity. But their messages grow more urgent and disturbing with each supernatural visit. Mary says the lady is getting impatient, Emma tells her parents one evening as they gather around Samuel's bedside. She says the harvest has never been delayed this long, and the hungry thing is beginning to consider taking more than it was promised. The threat implicit in these words chills both parents to the bone. They have been assuming the entity would be satisfied with Samuel's death, but their supernatural tormentor seems capable of escalating its demands if they continue to resist. James says there's another way, Emma continues, her voice taking on the cadence of someone much older. He says if one of us chooses to join them willingly, without fear or resistance, the harvest might be satisfied early. He says it doesn't have to be Samuel. It could be any of us. Margaret realizes with growing horror that the entity is offering them a terrible choice: sacrifice one child willingly to save the other, or risk losing both to supernatural retribution. The mathematics of love become impossibly complex when weighed against forces that view human life as nothing more than sustainable nourishment. Samuel, burning with fever despite their best efforts to cool him, sits up in his bed and speaks in a voice too old for his small body. "Papa," she says, "you have until the new moon to decide. Choose one child willingly, or she'll take both and begin the next cycle of 7 immediately." The ultimatum hangs in the air like a sword suspended over their family's future. Thomas looks at his wife, at his fading children, at the brass box that has unleashed decades of accumulated supernatural hunger, and realizes they have reached the point where hope becomes indistinguishable from madness. But Margaret, studying the ancient parchment by candlelight for the 100th time, suddenly straightens with an expression of desperate insight. "Thomas, look at this. The bargain specifies 7 children from each generation, but it doesn't specify that they must die as victims." She points to a section of Gaelic text she has been struggling to translate. "What if there's a loophole? What if we can satisfy the terms of the contract without losing our children?" The idea seems impossible, but as Thomas examines the faded writing, he begins to see what Margaret has discovered. The entity feeds on innocence and life force, but the contract's language suggests there might be ways to provide what it needs without surrendering their children's lives. "We have 2 days until the new moon," Margaret says, her voice gaining strength from desperate hope. 2 days to find a way to turn Seamus's bargain against the thing that made it. If you could save your living children by sacrificing yourself to something ancient and hungry, would you make that trade? Margaret spreads the ancient parchment across their kitchen table one final time, her fingers tracing Gaelic words that have haunted her dreams for days. The brass box sits open beside the document, its dark contents seeming to pulse with malevolent anticipation as the new moon approaches. Thomas stands at the window, watching fog roll across their homestead like a funeral shroud, while Emma and Samuel huddle together on the wooden bench, their small bodies growing more translucent with each passing hour. "I think I understand now," Margaret says, her voice carrying the calm clarity that comes just before desperate action. Seamus's bargain was specific in its language. 7 children from each generation, taken in innocence before they can carry the curse to their own offspring. Thomas turns from the window, studying his wife's face for signs of the madness that has claimed so many who have stared too long into supernatural darkness. But Margaret's eyes hold only fierce maternal determination and the terrible intelligence of someone who has found hope in the most unlikely place. The entity needs 7 children per generation, yes, but it doesn't specify that they must die as victims, Margaret continues. What if one of us could qualify as both the seventh child of our generation and the first of the next? The logic seems impossible, but as Margaret explains her reasoning, Thomas begins to see the mathematical loophole she has discovered. The curse counts generations by bloodline, but Margaret herself could technically qualify as the seventh child of her own generation. She had 6 siblings who died in infancy back in Ireland, deaths her family attributed to natural causes but which now seem suspiciously familiar. If I offer myself as the 7th sacrifice of my generation, Margaret explains, but do so willingly rather than as a victim, I might be able to confuse the entity's supernatural mathematics. The contract requires innocence, but it also requires the sacrifice to be taken, not given. From upstairs comes the sound of the pale woman's laughter, as if their supernatural tormentor finds Margaret's desperate logic amusing rather than threatening. But Emma, whose connection to the other world has grown stronger as the new moon approaches, suddenly sits up with wide eyes. "Mama, the lady doesn't think your plan will work," Emma reports, her small voice carrying otherworldly authority. She says willing sacrifice means nothing if you're too old to qualify as a child. Margaret's face hardens with determination that transforms her from grieving mother into something far more dangerous, a woman who has found purpose in impossible circumstances. "Then I'll have to make myself qualify." The pale woman materializes in their kitchen for the first time, no longer content to haunt only the children's rooms. She appears as Emma has described, wearing the green silk dress from the daguerreotype, her skin luminous with unnatural pallor, her smile revealing teeth that are too sharp and too numerous for any human mouth. "Clever child," the entity says, her voice carrying the accumulated weight of 3 generations of Elderglen deaths. "But cleverness will not save your offspring. The bargain was sealed in blood and desperation, and it will be honored according to its original terms." Margaret stands to face their tormentor directly, feeling the temperature in the room drop until her breath mists in the suddenly frigid air. "Then let's examine those original terms, shall we? You promised Seamus that his bloodline would prosper in the new world, that we would own land and never know hunger. Have you kept your side of the bargain?" The entity's too wide smile falters slightly. "Your family owns this land. You have never starved. But we have never prospered," Margaret counters. "We struggle to grow crops in soil that should be fertile. Our livestock sicken and die without explanation. The land you promised would bless us has been cursed by your presence. You have violated the terms of the original contract." Thomas realizes what his wife is attempting, not to break the supernatural contract, but to prove that the entity has already broken it through its own actions. If the bargain has been violated by one party, the other party should be free to withdraw. The pale woman's form flickers with what might be anger or might be uncertainty. "The terms were clear, mortal child. 7 children from each generation, taken before they can carry the curse to their own offspring," Margaret finishes. "But you've been taking more than 7 per generation, haven't you? You took 7 of Thomas's siblings when he was a child. You've taken 7 of our children. Now you want Samuel and Emma as well. That's not 7 per generation, that's 14. The entity's flickering intensifies, and for a moment Thomas glimpses what lies beneath the pale woman's facade, something ancient and hungry and bound by supernatural laws more complex than human understanding. The creature has been feeding beyond the contract's specifications, growing greedier with each generation, and Margaret has called attention to its violation. Furthermore, Margaret continues, gaining confidence from the entity's obvious discomfort, the contract specifies that children must be taken in innocence. But you've been corrupting them first, teaching them to accept death, making them complicit in their own destruction. Once they understand what's happening to them, they're no longer innocent. Samuel, burning with fever but somehow lucid, adds his small voice to his mother's argument. "She told me death was just sleeping, Mama. She made me want to go with her. But that means I wasn't innocent anymore when she was supposed to take me. The pale woman's form begins to lose cohesion, her carefully maintained human appearance dissolving to reveal glimpses of the bog thing she truly is, ancient peat and bone and accumulated malevolence held together by centuries of feeding on human suffering. Her voice, when she speaks, carries the sound of wind through empty graves. You think your clever words can unmake what was willingly given. The bargain stands, mortal children. If not 7 from this generation, then 14 from the next. If not 14, then 28. The debt will be paid. But Margaret has saved her most devastating argument for last. She reaches into the brass box and withdraws the vial of dark liquid, the blood used to seal the original contract. This is Seamus's blood, isn't it? The blood he used to bind his descendants to your hunger. The entity nods, her form stabilizing slightly as she focuses on the vial that represents her power over the Elderglen bloodline. Then you should recognize this, Margaret says, producing a small knife from her apron pocket. Before Thomas can stop her, she draws the blade across her palm, letting fresh blood drip into the ancient vial. I am Seamus's descendant, and I willingly add my blood to his. But I add it not as tribute, but as dissolution. She speaks words in Gaelic that she learned from the parchment, words that reverse the original binding, that offer the entity a choice, accept the dissolution of the contract and seek sustenance elsewhere, or face the consequences of having violated its own terms through greed and deception. The pale woman screams, a sound like wind through winter trees, like ice cracking under spring's first warmth. Her form begins to collapse inward, pulling the supernatural cold from the room and leaving behind only the scent of earth and rain. This is not finished, the entity snarls as she fades. The hunger never ends, mortal children. It only seeks new prey. But Thomas realizes that Margaret has accomplished something remarkable, not the destruction of the ancient entity, but its dismissal from their bloodline. The curse that has claimed 7 children per generation for 60 years has been broken through legal technicality rather than supernatural force. As the pale woman disappears completely, Samuel's fever breaks and color returns to Emma's translucent form. The brass box cracks down its center, its supernatural binding broken, and the ancient parchment crumbles to dust that smells of peat bogs and forgotten graves. Margaret collapses into Thomas's arms, exhausted by her confrontation with forces beyond mortal comprehension. But when she speaks, her voice carries the quiet satisfaction of a mother who has saved her children through intelligence and determination rather than supernatural intervention. It's over, she whispers. The harvest ends here. 6 months after the brass box crumbled to ancient dust, the Elderglen homestead bears the signs of a family learning to live without the shadow of supernatural dread. Samuel runs through their kitchen with the boundless energy of a healthy 3-year-old, his laughter echoing off walls that once carried the sound of too many funeral preparations. Emma has returned to the normal concerns of childhood, helping with chores, playing with her doll, asking endless questions about everything except the pale woman who no longer visits her dreams. But Margaret moves through their home like a woman forever changed by having glimpsed what lies beyond death's door. Her hair, once auburn, has turned silver white in the months since her confrontation with the entity. When she looks in the mirror, she sees eyes that hold depth, speaking of having stared into supernatural darkness and emerged victorious but not unscathed. Thomas finds her standing in their small cemetery one morning, placing wildflowers on 7 tiny graves that will forever mark the cost of their family's freedom. The children buried here, Mary, James, and 5 others whose names are carved into simple wooden crosses, represent the price paid for breaking a curse that should never have been made. Do you think they're at peace now? Thomas asks, joining his wife among the graves of their lost children. Margaret considers the question while arranging daffodils around Mary's headstone. I think they're free, she says finally. Free from being used as bait to trap the living, free from serving something that fed on their innocence. Whether that's the same as peace, I don't know. The supernatural quiet that has settled over their land feels different from the malevolent stillness that preceded the curse's breaking. This is the ordinary silence of a homestead removed from town, where the loudest sounds come from livestock and wind through trees rather than ghostly lullabies sung by the hungry dead. Emma approaches through the morning mist, carrying a small bouquet of Indian paintbrush she has gathered from the meadow behind their house. At 9 years old, she has developed an unusual relationship with death and grief, not fearful, but respectful, understanding that some losses leave permanent marks on those who survive them. "Mama, I dreamed about them again last night," Emma says, kneeling beside baby James's grave. "But this time they looked happy. They were playing together in a place with lots of sunlight, and they wanted me to tell you they're not trapped anymore." Margaret smooths her daughter's dark hair, noting how Emma's supernatural sensitivity has evolved from terrifying to comforting. The child can still see beyond the veil that separates the living from the dead, but now she serves as a bridge for healing rather than harvesting. "What else did they say, sweetheart?" "They said to tell Papa that the thing is gone from here, but it's not destroyed. They said it's looking for other families now, other desperate people who might make bargains they don't understand." The implication chills Thomas despite the warming spring air. Their victory over the supernatural entity was not its destruction but its banishment from their bloodline. Something ancient and hungry still roams the world, seeking new sources of sustenance, new families to curse with its endless appetite. "We should warn people," Thomas says. "Other Irish families, other immigrants who might carry similar curses." Margaret nods, already forming plans that will define the remainder of their lives. Father Mackenzie mentioned 7 other families in California who fled Ireland under suspicious circumstances. If the entity that cursed us is seeking new prey, they might be targeted next. Over the following weeks, the Elderglens begin the work of helping others break chains forged in desperation and hunger. They discover that Seamus's bargain was not unique. During the worst years of the Irish potato famine, dozens of starving families made similar pacts with entities that emerged from bog and moor and ancient burial ground. Some of these supernatural contracts remain dormant, waiting for the right generation to activate their terrible mathematics. Others are already claiming victims, their supernatural influence mistaken for natural childhood mortality in an era when many families expect to lose children to disease and accident. Margaret develops a reputation as someone who understands the supernatural mechanics of inherited curses. She travels throughout California with Thomas and their children, carrying knowledge gained through terrible experience to families trapped by their ancestors' desperate bargains. They learn that breaking such curses requires more than good intentions or religious intervention. Each supernatural contract contains unique terms and conditions, loopholes that can be exploited only by those who understand the specific language of otherworldly binding. Margaret becomes expert at reading the signs, mysterious childhood deaths following predictable patterns, supernatural manifestations that grow stronger with each generation, families whose prosperity comes at costs they don't consciously understand. The brass box that once contained their curse becomes a tool for detecting similar supernatural influences. Thomas has learned to recognize the particular way cursed metal resonates in the presence of otherworldly entities, using this knowledge to identify families in need of intervention before their own harvests begin. Emma serves as their most valuable asset in this work. Her ability to see and communicate with supernatural entities allows the family to negotiate with forces that most people cannot even perceive. She has learned to distinguish between ghosts seeking peace and entities seeking prey, helping other families understand which supernatural visitations represent genuine threats. But the work takes its toll on all of them. Margaret ages rapidly, each confrontation with otherworldly forces leaving new lines around her eyes and silver streaks in her hair. Thomas develops a persistent cough that seems to come from breathing too much supernatural air, and Emma's childhood is forever marked by conversations with the dead. Samuel, too young to fully understand their mission but old enough to sense its importance, adapts to a life where normal childhood concerns mix with supernatural responsibilities. He learns to sleep despite ghostly whispers in the walls, to play games while his family prepares for confrontations with entities older than human civilization. As autumn approaches, the season when Seamus first made his desperate bargain in the Irish peat bogs, Margaret stands once again among the 7 small graves behind their house. But this time she is not mourning victims of supernatural appetite. She is honoring children whose deaths, while tragic, served a purpose larger than any one family's grief. "You can rest now," she whispers to the graves, her words carrying across the homestead like a benediction. "Mama made sure the hungry thing can never harvest another crop from our bloodline. The curse ends here, with us, and your little lives helped break chains that might have bound our family forever." The wildflowers she places on each grave seem to glow in the dying light, and Thomas realizes that their lost children have become something more than victims of supernatural hunger. They have become guardians, protecting future generations of Elderglens from forces that would claim their innocence. As the family walks back toward their house, where warm light spills from windows that once held only shadows, Emma turns for one last look at the cemetery. "Mama, they say thank you. They say they're proud of what we did, and they'll keep watching over Samuel and any other babies we might have." Margaret's hand finds Thomas's as they climb the porch steps, both of them understanding that they have been given something rare, the chance to transform inherited trauma into protective legacy. The curse that once threatened to consume their entire bloodline has become the foundation for helping others escape similar supernatural snares. The harvest that began with Seamus's desperate bargain in 1803 has finally ended, not with the extinction of the Elderglen name but with its transformation into something larger than family identity. They have become guardians against the hungry darkness, protectors of families who faced the same terrible choices that once nearly destroyed their own. And in the warm light of their kitchen, as Margaret tucks Samuel into the bed where he once lay dying of supernatural fever, she knows that some curses can be broken not through force or magic, but through the mathematics of love applied with desperate intelligence to problems that seem impossible to solve. If this story stayed with you until the end, comment, "The harvest ends here," and tell us what you think breaks generational curses, love or sacrifice.